Hello everyone, this is Olivia Marinelli and I am the Project Nest South Substance Abuse Counselor. I am here today to hopefully help you gain more insight and understanding of addiction and substance use. As some of you may know, some of our residents may have struggled with substance use or could currently be struggling with a substance use problem. So it's important for us to gain more knowledge about drug and alcohol use. I wanted to start with this first slide to give you a sense of how serious addiction can be. Being a substance use counselor over the past 12 years, I've seen all of the things listed here happen to people who are struggling with an alcohol or drug addiction. So let's get started by looking at what addiction is. Addiction is a chronic disease that affects the brain. And there's all types of addictions: gambling, sex, shopping, eating. But we will just be focusing on drug and alcohol addiction. Addiction is characterized by compulsive drug or alcohol seeking and continued use of drugs or alcohol despite negative consequences in someone's life, such as the loss of a job, the loss of relationships, or legal problems that are happening from the continued drug or alcohol use. Addiction is also a lot like other diseases such as heart disease or diabetes because both of them disrupt the normal healthy functioning of an organ in the body, and both require treatment or they can be life-threatening. Next, we're going to start to look at why do people use drugs or drink alcohol. Well, one of the most obvious reasons is that drugs make people feel good. But let's dig a little deeper because there's a lot more to it than just feeling good. Some people might begin using drugs or alcohol because there is a family history of addiction. Drug or alcohol addiction is more common in some families, and it likely involves a genetic predisposition. So if you have a blood relative, such as your mother or a sibling, with an alcohol or drug addiction, you're at greater risk of developing a drug or alcohol addiction. Another one could be peer pressure, and this is really true for young people. It seems to be a strong factor in them starting to use and misuse drugs and alcohol. Third, lack of family involvement. Difficult family situations or lack of a bond with parent or siblings may increase the risk of addiction. And lastly, injuries or medical issues. Some people developed an addiction to opiate pills, for example, after they were prescribed those due to an injury or other medical issues. In the previous slide, I gave you some reasons why people might use drugs or alcohol. But in my experience of being a substance abuse counselor and the clients that I've worked with, one of the biggest reasons that I saw that someone started to use drugs or alcohol is to escape mental or emotional pain. Many people with addictions have suffered some type of trauma, such as abuse, death of a loved one, or rape. So as a result of this trauma, they may experience depression, anxiety, and other mental health concerns, and the use of drugs or alcohol can provide temporary relief from these symptoms. So for some of us who might not be that familiar with how addiction affects the brain, we might say to ourselves, why can't people just stop using? Well, the brain is like a control tower. It sends signals that controls your actions and choices. But when you take drugs, the chemical signals in your brain change and can affect your choices and actions and even the way you feel. People get a rush or a high from using, but over time the high is not as strong and they need more of the drug to stop from feeling bad. Some drugs, such as heroin or opiate pills, can have very unpleasant symptoms if you stop taking them suddenly. So someone that is using will use just not to get these symptoms. In the next two slides, we're going to take a quick look at some drug and alcohol use statistics. In 2018, 19.3 million people aged 18 or older had a substance use disorder. 2.1 million LGB adults aged 18 or older had a substance use disorder, and 1.5 million LGB adults aged 18 or older had a substance use disorder and a mental health problem. In 2018, they also found that there was a significant increase in marijuana, methamphetamine, and LSD use in LGB adults aged 26 and older. And also, LGB adults that struggle with a substance use disorder are associated with an increased risk of suicide. The first substance we're going to take a look at is alcohol. So in 2018, 14.4 million adults had an alcohol use disorder. Alcohol use can cause damage to major organs and weaken your immune system. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration defines heavy alcohol use as binge drinking on 5 or more days in the past month. And binge drinking would equal 4 drinks for women and 5 drinks for men in about 2 hours. So now we're going to take a look at some commonly used drugs, and I've placed them into 2 categories to kind of help you remember the effects that they can have on your body. So first we're going to look at stimulants. They're also known as uppers. Someone that's struggling with an addiction, that's most likely the way they're going to describe them is uppers. So they can include cocaine or crack, Adderall, or methamphetamines. And they are basically energizing. They increase your heart rate, your blood pressure, and they can increase anxiety and paranoia. So the next category of commonly used drugs that we're going to look at are depressants. And those are also known as downers. And they can include heroin, Xanax, Percocet, and Ambiens. And the reason we call them downers is because of their effects. They can slow down your breathing and your brain activity. They can also lower your blood pressure, cause slurred speech, and also drowsiness. The first drug we're going to take a closer look at is cocaine. So cocaine is also known as crack or blow. The common ways it could be taken can be snorted, smoked, injected, or the street term for that would be shooting up. Some of the effects could be enlarged pupils, increased energy, insomnia, anxiety, paranoia, strokes, or heart attacks. And withdrawal symptoms usually include depression, tiredness, increased appetite, and insomnia. The next drug we're going to take a look at is marijuana, and marijuana right now is the most used illicit drug. So some of the possible short-term and long-term health effects could be slowed reaction time, problems with balance and coordination, feeling drowsy, increased heart rate and appetite, mental health problems, frequent respiratory infections, and marijuana withdrawal symptoms could be irritability, trouble sleeping, decreased appetite, and anxiety. In the previous slide, we spoke about marijuana, but there is also something called synthetic cannabinoids, which are also known as K2, spice, or black mamba. So they're basically a wide variety of herbal mixtures containing man-made cannabinoid chemicals related to THC and marijuana, but often much stronger and more dangerous. They're also sometimes misleadingly called synthetic marijuana and marketed as a natural, safe, legal alternative to marijuana. But some of the side effects could include increased heart rate, agitation, hallucinations, anxiety, and increased blood pressure. The withdrawal symptoms could include headaches, anxiety, depression, and irritability. So another group of drugs that we're going to look at is club drugs. So some of them can include GHB, which is sometimes used as a date rape drug, Rohypnol, also known as roofies, MDMA, which you might know as ecstasy or Molly, ketamine, also known as Special K, LSD or acid, methamphetamine, also known as crystal meth or Tina, and PCP, also known as angel dust. So the common ways these are taken: they can be smoked, snorted, injected, swallowed, or put into drinks and dissolved. So these have a mix of effects. These can be uppers or downers and can cause drowsiness, hallucinations, confusion, increased energy, dizziness, increased body temperature, and slowed breathing. And some of the withdrawal symptoms could be insomnia, anxiety, headaches, or depression. So on this slide, we're going to take a look at heroin. And heroin is usually called dope. The ways it can be taken are injected, also known as shooting up, smoked, or snorted. So some of the effects include euphoria, nodding out, itching, slowed breathing, and slow heart rate. Heroin users describe the high as being like a kid on Christmas morning, falling in love, coming into a warm house from a cold, rainy day, or being wrapped up in a warm blanket. The withdrawal symptoms can include restlessness, muscle and bone pain, insomnia, diarrhea, vomiting, and cold flashes with goosebumps. Pretty much, this feels like a really bad case of the flu. One drug that has begun surfacing a few years ago and has caused many overdose deaths is known as fentanyl. It's sold on the streets in pill form or as a white powder, and it's usually added to other drugs such as heroin or cocaine without people even knowing, which leads to an increased overdose risk. Fentanyl is 50 times more deadly than heroin and 100 times more deadly than morphine. And just take a look at this quick picture here. The amount of fentanyl that can fit into that sugar packet can kill hundreds of people. Let's take a look now at methamphetamines. So methamphetamine use is a particular problem with the population that we serve. And as we said before, crystal meth or methamphetamines can also be known as Tina or crank. The ways taken could be injected, which is also known as shooting up or banging the drug, or it can be smoked. Some of the effects include increased energy, which leads to increased physical activity, decreased appetite, which leads to weight loss, and increased breathing and heart rate. And the withdrawal symptoms can include depression, anxiety, and tiredness. According to a New York Times article, gay men are more likely to try meth than straight men. So one explanation could be that gay men struggle with acceptance in ways straight men don't have to. Growing up gay and being forced to keep that a secret for fear of family rejection or neighborhood bullying can create huge insecurities and issues with intimacy. So some of the hookup apps like Grindr make finding meth as well as men to use it with pretty fast and easy. Meeting a stranger from the internet for the first time is stressful for anyone, especially for someone who might struggle to form deep connections. But using meth creates an instant false sense of intimacy and trust, allowing a cheap escape from the problems of our daily lives. In the moment, it seems euphoric, and the drug is associated with enhanced sexual pleasure. So the final category that we're going to look at is prescription drugs of abuse. So some of these include Xanax, Klonopins, Ambien, codeine, Percocets, Oxycontin, and Vicodin, and also Adderall. And recently, another highly abused prescription drug by those with a drug addiction is gabapentin, also called Neurontin. So some of the ways these can be taken could be swallowed, injected, or snorted. The effects could include increased energy, slowed breathing, nausea, or itchiness. And some of the withdrawal symptoms could be seizures, depression, sweating, body aches, and chills. One very important thing is being able to recognize an overdose. We need to keep in mind that most of the heroin currently on the street is laced with fentanyl, which greatly increases the risk of overdose, like we spoke about before. They are even finding that marijuana and cocaine has been laced with fentanyl. So please keep in mind that overdose risk increases when mixing certain drugs together. Let's remember from before the downers, which can slow your heart rate and breathing. So if we mix 2 downers, heroin and Xanax, the chance for overdose increases. If someone is overdosing, they may present as having lack of, slow, or infrequent breathing, no response to stimulation, which means you're calling the person's name, tapping their arm, shaking them, and they are not responding to you. Their skin might be clammy and pale. You might hear deep snoring or gurgling, and their limbs might be heavy and limp. Please call 911 if you feel as though someone is having an overdose. As I get ready to wrap up this presentation, I wanted us to take a look at how we can reduce stigma and provide support to someone who might be struggling with an addiction. It might be helpful to understand how addiction is not a choice and it actually stems from changes within the brain, which we talked about earlier. Understanding that addiction is not a choice might help you have less stigma towards those with an addiction. Another thing, don't speak negatively or accusingly to someone who is struggling with a substance use disorder because it may trigger feelings of guilt or shame, which may hinder the person's recovery. And finally, language matters. The way we talk about drugs and the people who use them can increase stigma. Words like crackhead or junkie can dehumanize a person struggling with an addiction. In closing, there are many different treatment options available for people, but it can take several treatment attempts for someone to be able to maintain recovery. We need to remember that relapse is a part of recovery. Recovery is a lifelong process and requires maintenance every day, just like someone with diabetes. If you have any further questions or comments, feel free to email me at the email address below.